we did for a long time call this the business that wouldn't die, because every time we had a near-death experience, it was only that. It was a near-death experience, and we picked ourselves up and carried on. And yeah, I mean, I've never run 100 miles. I have run 100k, but I can't, and I've certainly not run 250 miles, but I can imagine that some of that mentality around just sort of really not thinking about where the finish line is and keep putting one foot in front of the other is just a huge part of it, basically. But I've always asked myself the question, what would I rather be doing? And the answer has probably been not a lot else other than doing this. So double down, put the effort in, see it grow.
Welcome to Long Run Labs, a weekly podcast from the team behind For the Long Run podcast, telling the stories of those running the outdoor industry where endurance and entrepreneurship meet. The app I've been waiting for years is finally here. I've spent over a decade at the intersection of blood work and behavior change, and the one thing that never existed, a single place that takes in all of the data and changes as you do. Your labs, your wearable, your training, all of it, one spot, until now. I've been working with Eternal for the last year, and I'm thrilled to announce a new version of our app that not just takes in your data and displays it, but actually does something with it. And it helps with coaching and medical issues too. Instead of one more dashboard to decode, Eternal gives you guidance. It tells you what's worth your attention this week and what isn't. Here's the part I can't get over. It turns your health and performance report into a podcast. An actual episode about your numbers, your history, what you're training for, via a conversation between a host and an expert. The core experience is free, and that includes the podcast. You add what you need from there, like a $39 energy panel covering ferritin, B12, and other markers that explain why you're tired. If you train at altitude like I do, that's a no-brainer. Download Eternal, connect your data, and get guidance. It's the closest thing I've found to a team in your corner that actually knows you. Find it at Eternal Health in the App Store, and let me know what you think. And welcome back. We have Andy Blow joining on the podcast today. Andy, thanks so much for taking some time to chat.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. Good to be chatting.
Of course. Been wanting to have this conversation for a while, so let's get rolling. First question, who is Andy?
These days, I'm a dad, business owner, husband, now more of an ex-athlete. I always defined myself as a bit of an athlete when I was younger, and being more comfortable these days with being an ex-athlete, but I still keep my hand in.
What's that journey been like? I know a lot of people, everyone goes through that at some point. How do you grapple with that?
Yeah, it is. It's a tough one to grapple with. It has been a tough one to grapple with at times, because if you're young, competitive, and you do sport for competitive reasons, which was very much, I think, why I was into it, then you do spend a lot of time defining yourself around being an athlete and being competitive, being at the front of races and that kind of thing. And as that slips away over the years, you do have to decide if there are other reasons for carrying on and doing it. And I've found lots of other reasons, but it sometimes takes a bit of time to catch up with yourself, But yeah, I'm definitely still as enthusiastic about the sport and sports as I've always been, just now for very different reasons.
Was it a tough process for you? Is that something that took many years, or is it, you're still kind of working through it?
No, it was definitely a tough process when it started to happen. In my late 20s, I still had ambitions to try and really make a go of it as a full-time athlete, and I was kind of semi-managing that, but always working alongside it. I ended up getting a knee injury that required surgery and put me out for a while, and that paid to that. For a while after that was probably the toughest time, was like trying to decide, what did I want to do it all for? And eventually before I had kids, that became running a business. And I found that actually I got a lot of enjoyment and quite a kick out of doing that. And then when your family comes along, you kind of meld that with a different kind of purpose. I think my business partner, Johnny, is a very different example, because he's a bit younger than me, quite a bit younger than me. And he was a very competitive athlete. He was a world silver medalist at kayaking when I met him and we were first working together. And he was very impressive. He's an impressive guy overall, but he was extremely impressive in the way that he went from trying to qualify for the Olympics kind of 1 month, and then almost a few months later, he decided that he wanted to join me and get into business. And he put that same energy and tenacity and determination into us working together and growing the business. And he had an impressively fast transition from that kind of identifying himself exclusively as a sports person to kind of changing that. And I actually learned a lot from watching him do that, I think. And I've seen it with others. It is impressive when people can switch roles like that.
Why do you think there's so much overlap, or what is it about the overlap that makes it such an easy transition or such a simple transition?
I think if you're super competitive, business is a good place to be because there's always someone to compete with, whether they want to compete with you or not. It's a competitive landscape. So that's one of the big things, really. Also, all of the cliche stuff about, like hard work paying off one step at a time, the early starts, the late finishes, ability to tolerate a bit of discomfort and pain. I think all of that is very compatible with growing anything.
How do you leverage that competitive nature without falling into the comparison trap, right? There are 1,000,001 sports nutrition brands out there, and they all say they're the best, and they all say that their product doesn't give stomach upset and that they thought about science in the best way. How do you use that as fuel for competition versus that comparison piece?
I think we're predominantly internally competitive with ourselves, and we don't try and compete too much. We try to be aware of what our competitors are doing, but not to look at competing with them directly. I think that's always been a mindset that we've had. It's been just the way we've opted to do things. Focus on what we're doing. It's another cliche, control the controllables. I think I liken it to sort of, if you're a swimmer, you kind of, or a track athlete, you're running 100 meters, you run in your lane and you are aware of what's going on around you, but you can't focus on that. You've got to run, you've got to focus on running your race or swimming your race, or in our case, executing our plans and doing what we want to do. Of course, we're aware of what other people are doing, and we look at it for inspiration, particularly when your competitors are doing great stuff. You have to respond yourself, but not necessarily in a direct way. Often it's just that sense of having to up your game. And we've seen a lot of change in sports nutrition we've been around 15 years now, and the landscape around us has changed dramatically.
I want to wind it back 15 plus years ago. I love understanding the why behind why a product and company comes into existence. If I recall, you created the product because it was something that you needed. Was that kind of the evolution of how it came to be?
Yeah, it was out of personal necessity and interest. I was a triathlete. I was competing in hot events, and my performance was falling off a cliff. I would do well in the cold, and in the heat, I would fall apart. I'd end up in the medical tent with hyponatremia, and that happened on numerous occasions. I was kind of aware it was something to do with my sweat loss and my hydration, and I wasn't really getting that right. But it wasn't until I spoke to a friend of mine who was a medic, who really looked at the sweat loss piece with me and explained to me that electrolyte loss was quite an individual thing, and that you could do a sweat test. So precision hydration, as it was then, didn't evolve as a product. It evolved as a sweat test, because I had a sweat test in a hospital, found that I lose tons of sodium in my sweat, changed my nutritional regime as a result. And then the first iteration of the business was to get into sweat testing, because it wasn't available for athletes. And at that time, our ambitions were really small. I was running a sports science lab, and I just wanted to add another test to what we did with athletes in the lab. But the fact that it caught on and started to show a bit of promise was what eventually led to sweat testing becoming a bit broader, and then eventually doing our own product line.
So what happens next? How does that natural evolution occur? And the reason I ask is I love when a business is created to solve a problem versus like going after a market opportunity. It's like, this is a thing that you want to exist. Maybe there are other people that want it to exist. And I'd say you were right about that.
Yeah. I think the next for us is always then a small evolution on what's currently working and what's happening, because what we know is most people at Precision Fuel and Hydration, we're still a relatively small company. Although we've grown a lot over 15 years, we're still not massive. And a lot of us are athletes. A lot of us are still training, competing, using products. And we know that whilst we think we have many, many best in class products, there's still ways to improve them. There might be ways to improve the packaging. There might be ways to improve the formulation. There's definitely a whole bunch of stuff that you can do and it just takes time to evolve it. And sometimes there are big shifts you make. We went from being precision hydration to precision fuel and hydration during COVID, when we had time to stop and introduce a whole fueling range. But one of the things we talk about a lot internally at work is that the human body is not going to evolve out of needing electrolytes, carbohydrates, fluids as the predominant three things it needs for exercise anytime soon. So we're not going to suddenly discover like a fourth or fifth element that's going to change the game. We're not looking at for that kind of another big paradigm shift. We're looking at saying, okay, well, if we know that, athletes are trying to take more carbohydrate per hour, how can we help them do that efficiently, carry it nicely? Gel, we've always said gel packets have got a bit better over the years, but the first gel packets that came out in the 80s are not that dissimilar from the ones that we use now. They're little plastic or foil sachets. Maybe there's a better way of doing all of that. We started to look into that with the flow gel, which is, a kind of runnier gel that you can use in flasks and pouches and things. But I think there's loads of small iterative improvements that can happen now. I wouldn't rule out that there'll be other big shifts over time, but I think a lot of it is based around that. Carbs, fluid, sodium is what we need. How do we deliver it better and more palatably to athletes?
So in the discussion of how do we deliver it better to athletes, you've specifically chosen to separate fuel from hydration. So the gels don't have sodium, and you have a variety of permutations of sodium content from the sachets and the tablets. Talk to me about this system that you've built and why you created all of these different SKUs versus saying we're going to make a gel that has 30 grams of carbs, 300 milligrams of sodium, and take 2 or 3 or 4 an hour and you'll get what you need.
Basically, it's all down to individualization, because what I know is that the three numbers that you need to hit your carb number per hour, you need to hit your fluid number per hour, and your sodium number per hour. And my numbers are going to be different to yours. So if we try and put everything into one product, let's say I need twice the sodium that you need, but all of the sodium is in a single product. If I try and take twice the amount of that, I'm probably going to be way over consuming volume, and I'm probably going to be way over consuming carbohydrate as well. So separating them out, the three levers, as we call them, means you can pull those three levers independently. And basically then you can get the right amount that you need in each one. Now, what we have started to do, we have got products that combine both. So we've got a carbon electrolyte drink mix, for example, which you can use as a component of your fueling. But we've also got lots of standalone products like electrolyte capsules, electrolyte only drinks, carbohydrate only products. And we have been playing around more recently with things like putting some electrolytes into a gel. How does that work? What does it taste like? Because a lot of other companies have those in by default. So I wouldn't rule out that in the future, like we've got a caffeine gel, there might be an electrolyte gel as well, but it will never replace the carbohydrate only gel as well. Because we want to give athletes the toolkit to build their plan from. Try and make it as clear as possible, try and make it as simple as possible, so that, because sports nutrition is often becomes a bit mystified, or becomes a bit overhyped and a bit overcomplicated. Perhaps not willfully, but perhaps just because by confusing athletes a bit, nutrition companies can sort of sell them their magic formula or whatever, or their magic process. We try and take a bit more approach of like, okay, this is a toolkit. And a big part of what we try and do is educate you on how to put your tool bag together for a race.
As someone who has a very high sodium rate, I just did a test with you guys, and I tested at 1310 milligrams per liter. So as someone that has a high sodium rate, the more places I can find sodium, the better. So I'll be rooting for that. But yeah, my mix right now is that the carb and electrolyte mix plus 2 gels an hour, and I'm still not getting enough sodium. So it's something I'm continuing to tinker with in the pursuit of like at least a gram of sodium an hour.
Yeah, we should definitely get you on the early test list then for an electrolyte gel.
there's so much dogma in sports nutrition and fueling these days. I watch Tim Noakes continue to tout low carb fueling, and the fact that so many people who have chosen high carb fueling, in his words, are addicted to sugar. I tweeted at him and I was like, if low carb is the way, why do I feel like crap when I take less than 50 grams an hour on the long run? He said, you're addicted to sugar. What's the response to that? And I mean, I said to him, and I was having a conversation with somebody else, and I was like, look, if you look at the pro peloton in the Tour de France, that's the best. Or tell me if you agree with this. I think the pro peloton in the Tour de France is the best science experiment that exists to see what works. It's 3 weeks of all out, high intensity, and there's no room for things that don't work. And it's like throwing a bunch of eggs at a wall and seeing what doesn't break. And there are outliers that can exist in that period of time, but the whole field can't be outliers, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think on the point around Tour de France and pro cycling in general, I agree with you. I think the big thing there is the number of athletes that are competing at a very high level for the number of weeks and days that they do across the year. You know, they get to test and refine so much more than ultra runners do, for example. What ultra runners, even a really good ultra runner might do 4 or 5 big races in a year if they're able to. So the amount of repetition you get on trying new things to see if they work and there's a lot of rinse and repeat in cycling. Although stages are different, conditions are different, fundamentally a lot of it is like the same kind of distances at the same kind of paces with the same kind of support. They do have all the teams now have sports scientists and nutritionists tweaking things and working on things, and there is a kind of Darwinian approach to ideas that work and don't work. Like if low carb really worked, they would be doing it in the peloton because people have tried it. You know, the fact that they're all moving towards high is a very, very strong indication. And the science is kind of coming behind it to back some of it up, is that we're seeing that the numbers are getting higher and higher and higher. And now the danger with that, I suppose, so if you go back to the Noakes thing, the danger with all of that, and he did a similar thing a number of years ago, really attacking electrolytes and the use of sodium in drinks and things. And part of his point, I think, is that it's easy for us to get dragged into this world where like just taking a magic something is the solution to your problems. And, you know, that is where, if I'm going to agree with him anywhere, it's like there's no magic elements that you can just take that make all the difference. And also, do the vast majority of the population probably overconsume sodium and also overconsume sugar for the level of energy output and exercise they do? Absolutely. You know, that message is probably not a bad message. And I sometimes think Noakes' position as like being a contrarian is about setting up the other side of that debate. So maybe he's not actually genuinely is completely extreme in his views, but what he's doing is providing a counterpoint to the narrative at the moment that's going like, take more of everything to see your performances. And I can see that there's a role for that, because there is a danger that the average athlete, which is what most of us are, we're not the elites, that if we think, oh, well, we should be taking 130, 150 grams of carbohydrate an hour and 1,000 or 1,500 milligrams of sodium an hour all the time, that's probably not either a healthy or a beneficial choice. But in all of the case studies and all of the data that we're looking at with a lot of elite athletes we're working with, it's a trend that we're seeing support really big performances. And we all know that in the sport of ultra running at the moment, there are course records are being taken down every year. You know,
every
races
week
are getting more competitive every week. It's way harder now to be competitive at the top of that sport than it was even 3 or 5 years ago. And nutrition isn't the only thing about that, but it's a huge part of it. You know, I think less so than on the roads, but we know that the carbon shoe and the foams in the shoes is helping. A lot better understanding of cooling technology and that kind of thing in the hot races where a lot of ultras are, and then carbohydrates, electrolyte supplementation, boosted, individualized. I think all of that is helping to support these faster performances. So yeah, that's where I've sort of been dogged by Noakes through my career, not personally at all, but when we started doing sweat testing was around the time that his book Waterlogged came out and sort of rubbished the idea of electrolytes. And we spent the first 2 or 3 years of existence kind of trying to justify why we were taking a different position to Noakes, which is quite a tough thing to do because at the time, the author of The Law of Running is a real authority in sport. And I'd studied his textbooks and things. But I think, again, that Darwinian thing, like, I think if the sweat testing, the taking electrolytes had been, as he described it, like a complete waste of time, I don't think it would have survived the test of time. And we've seen it help so many athletes.
It's a mix of like the science and the anecdotal piece of it. Like if that weren't true, you wouldn't be seeing, like, somebody other than David Roche would have set the course record at Leadville. So how do you as a scientist grapple with the overwhelming anecdotal evidence? Or I guess it just aligns with the scientific evidence too, right?
I think in a lot of ways it starts to, because the science often takes a little bit longer to catch up. And we try and do we do a little bit of research-based science. We have a lab now at PFNH and we've started to do studies in the lab. But the majority of the sort of analytical data collection that we do is in the field. One, because it's the most practical for us to collect, because we work with a lot of elite athletes. We're on hand with them at races and we can really take a look at what they're eating and drinking and measure it, report it back. And secondly, because I'm a big believer that being at the cutting edge with athletes who are at the top of their game and observing what they do and recording it is a really useful way to start to spot trends and to start to see what's working and what's not working. That's why our case study database on the website is open to all to view, because I think we don't try to tell people what to take from that information. It's like the information's all up there, and in aggregate, you can see the direction in things are going. We've got years of data now on the Western States 100 or UTMB or whatever, and it's only at the moment, it's only handfuls of athletes in each of those. But as we build it, we've got Caleb Olson's data from, when he got in the top 10 to when he won. We've got the same with Chris Myers going from 10th to 2nd. Now we're starting to pick data up on people like Rachel Entrekin with Cocodona. We had Emily and her crew at this year's amazing race, weighing all of her gel packets that went in and out, weighing all of her drink bottles and that kind of thing. So we're really starting to see, and that is not hard placebo, double-blind controlled studies, but what it is it's real life study in a scientific way of what elite athletes are doing. And I think that's really powerful information. It's kind of where anecdote and science start to come together.
Yeah, I was going to bring up Rachel because she went from not fueling super well while still setting the course record to even 60 grams an hour over 56 hours. And she took down the men's course record, let alone the women's course record. And so she's been training at this level for years. You and Norda gave her the ability to do it full time. So her life stress bucket is a little bit lower in this past year. So that certainly has an influence. But the fueling piece, particularly over a 56-hour endeavor, is cannot be ignored.
No, I think so. And what I want to be cautious of is not trying to overclaim what we've done there. We've worked really hard with Rachel, and Emily, who's worked directly with her, has done a fabulous job in terms of getting Rachel's confidence such that Rachel will listen to what she says and implement what she asks her to do from a nutritional standpoint. And I do feel like it's been positively impactful. I think what we can certainly say is that whatever she's done on that side has not negatively impacted what she's doing. Definitely. She is, however, as we all know, like an incredible athlete, human being, all on her own. And you sort of feel like maybe she'd be one of those people who could probably do pretty much anything with very little. But I think I do think that I said to the team afterwards, I said, this feels like one of those situations where, because we've worked with her longitudinally for a while and really got the confidence of the athlete to follow the plan's been executed. It has been a real brick in that wall of performance, basically. Just because you fuel right doesn't mean you can do what Rachel Entrekin does. There's so many pieces to that puzzle. But I think that what we're proving is that that's, there's certainly a benefit that she's seeing to that. And, up until recently, there was a lot of, and there still is going to be a lot of debate about how do you fuel these ultra long races? We're fascinated in that. And that's why we had so many people, because we were not only crewing Rachel in that race, we crewed half a dozen athletes. And it was really fascinating to see the differences in their intake data between that and the 100Ks and 100 milers that we have so much more information on, because it is still wildly different.
So we talked a lot about elite athletes. Let's talk about amateur athletes. What are amateur athletes getting right? What are amateur athletes getting wrong as it relates to fuel and hydration?
I think most amateur athletes, honestly, even with the amount of chat that goes on about it now, the biggest failing is just not really engaging with having a great plan for what they're going to do nutritionally. I see so many people still who have a very suck it and see kind of laissez-faire approach to what they're going to do nutritionally in their long training sessions and in their races. And yeah, that has started to change, but the biggest change most people can make is being way more planned and intentional about what their intake is, and even understanding what their current intake is. The amount of athletes I see who don't record even what they eat on their long runs and drink on their long runs. They don't occasionally weigh themselves before and after long runs to see how much fluid they're losing or how much dehydration deficit they're in. These are really simple things that they can be doing, but probably aren't. So, and yet we focus on marginal gains. We spend a lot of time talking about the differences between two different types of lug on two very slightly different vibram soles or something like that, and how much different that's going to make. But at the end of the day, if you didn't take enough gels per hour, then it doesn't really matter. You could be barefoot, wouldn't make any difference. So I think being planned, being intentional, and then evolving your nutrition intake towards big races is probably the biggest thing that people can do.
It's almost like a business like yours should have a free offering on their website that should help people with something like this, right?
It is so funny. You should mention that. Yeah, no, kind of joking aside, that free tool, the free fuel and hydration planner that you're referring to, we built it because in the early days of Precision, Johnny and I would be stood at expos talking to athletes, and they'd give us all their history and like what they were doing and how long the race was going to take them and they'd want advice like, how do I then put a plan together for this? And we started to build a bit of an algorithm. We started off in Microsoft Excel, and we would take down some of those key bits of information and we would compare, okay, how good can we make our algorithm compared with what we would recommend to that athlete based on hearing the full story of what they've told us. And over time, that became a tool that we then built more formally to take to shows and expos, to do in person. And eventually we moved it onto the website. And then, of course, all the time now it's being refined and developed. But the whole idea is that, really coming back to what I said earlier, as an athlete, you need to have a ballpark number for carbs per hour, fluid per hour, sodium per hour. The online fuel and hydration planner is built specifically to take a bunch of inputs about you as an individual. So what we can glean about your physiology, what kind of race you're doing, duration, intensity, the weather conditions that you're doing it in. And then from that information, we can give you a pretty good ballpark figure on carbs, fluid and sodium per hour. And at that point, you can then take that and go forward and test it and refine it and trial it. And I think that's just better than, it's kind of like starting with a vague route in mind of where you're going rather than just going out the door and not knowing which way to turn.
Quick one if you're heading to TrailCon this summer. We're going to be boots on the ground out there with the team from Popfly, our partners who are doing some great work in the creator, affiliate, and UGC space. If leveling up your UGC game is on your list this summer, and let's be honest, it should be, this is a good chance to connect with the right people in person. So if that's you, reach out to me directly and I'll make sure we link up around TrailCon. If you're enjoying Long Run Labs, we'd love it if you took a moment to leave a review. It only takes a minute, but it helps the show reach more people like you. If an episode has helped you think differently about your business or career, made a long run fly by, or taught you something new, scroll down in your podcast app and tap those stars and write a review. Thank you for your support. Okay, so we've spent the first half of this conversation talking about the science side of the business. Let's switch to the business side of the business. Maybe it's a little too late to mention, but you guys have been sponsoring my podcast since February. It's a product that I've been using for years now, since Hayden Hawks introduced me to the brand, I don't know, 3 years ago. He was like, "Hey, you should try these gels and this drink mix." And so I did, and I loved it. And I've been running with the gels and chews and such ever since. And I was just introduced to the drink mix earlier this year. I'm curious, how do you weigh these micro audiences versus large event sponsorships like Ironman? Like, how does the confluence of small shows and a property like mine or single track or something like that compare to like an Ironman?
Yeah, we've developed all of the partnerships that we've developed, even the really big ones like Ironman, have developed relatively organically over the years. The business has been grown organically. Johnny and I have never taken outside capital or much help from people outside of the business. We've just got on with it, reinvested. We've built relationships. We're part of the communities that we operate in, and we haven't sort of tried to foist ourselves upon those communities. We just get involved with the sports. We love it, and we've got people in the business who do. So I would say a lot of the relationships, like the one with you, I remember chatting to you at least 2 years ago when, off the back of the conversation with Hayden, I was aware that you're using the product. So the way we're working with Long Run is very typical for how we work with people. Is we build over time, we build a relationship. When that relationship feels authentic, you then look to take it as we've grown and as people's platforms and properties have grown around us. It's like, okay, well, let's formalize this. Let's look at a commercial arrangement, and let's try to use those platforms to communicate to the audiences that we want to reach, the message around our products. And even with Ironman, it was kind of like that. As stupid as it sounds, they're a massive property, but no one sat around here at PF&H and said, we want to do a deal with Ironman. What happened was I was a triathlete, so I've always had a soft spot for the Ironman brand. It was the biggest race Kona was the race I always wanted to do. And then with the business, we ended up going to a lot of Ironman races, buying expo space. We went to the Ironman World Championships in Nice and we rented a house there. We were not a partner of the event, and we marketed ourselves hard from our house. And we did such a good job that we had a visit from Ironman's legal team who were saying that we were infringing, on their turf. They had a different hydration partner at the time. And we had a pretty difficult confrontation with them, because you're like, well, we're here, our audience are here, we've rented this house, we're doing all this promotional stuff. You call it guerrilla marketing. We just call it just showing up, and we're not doing anything wrong. And anyway, that kind of happened. And then a few months later, they were looking for a new partner. They gave us a call. They said, you've obviously been showing up. You obviously see some value in coming to these events. And we started a conversation, and we started off small, and we took some races on with them in Europe, and then we expanded it to Oceania. And then 2026, we've taken it to a global partnership. So even that's really organically evolved over time. The events, we got involved with Viper and Cocodona this year because we were hearing such good things about the race from Rachel and other athletes that we're working with. I had a conversation with Erica at Viper, who it turns out is one of the biggest fans of our chews, our energy chews. And she's like, we'd love to have your energy chews on course. And then you can actually kind of look back and go, I can go into our website and go, yeah, no, I can see that Erica's bought chews from our website. So this is really authentic. And then we get involved. So I think the authenticity thing is often over labored, and I'm over laboring it now potentially, but we do feel like it's the way we show up and work with people is quite genuine, very genuine. It's probably less strategic. If we had a board of directors, we've started to build an advisory board for the business to help Johnny and I. And I guess there's going to be, and there are conversations around strategy and longer term thinking and all the rest of it. But up until relatively recently, we've very much kind of gone with our hearts, gone with our guts. We don't want to change that particularly, but as you get bigger as a business, you perhaps have to just, rather than, changing strategy, it probably means taking a slightly longer term view.
Yeah, it's interesting. So Boulderthon's another one that you guys are working with this year. And then I've had the pleasure of working with your athlete manager, Brad, around a couple of athlete deals. And the way that I would describe it is it's like a dating experience. Like it's a getting to know you. It's let's send some product with no obligation. And that evolves into something real. And so I connected him with Ruben Sonka, who's a Cape Verde athlete and 2012 Olympian and trying to make the 2028 Olympics 16 years later. And Ruben was like, I take down hundreds of dollars of gels a month already. And so it was like a quick getting to know you period because the product awareness was already there and he's been using it a lot. So it's cool to see the seriousness that you approach these partnerships with. And as someone on the other side who's doing the partnerships, it forces success because it's organic and authentic, right? I'm not out there making things up about how I use the product. I'm not like getting to know the product as I'm telling people that I think that they should use it. And so it's a tough filter, but it's a necessary filter that I wish more companies would use because there's just so much pay to play that exists out there where people are just happy to take a paycheck versus like, so one of my filters is like, I wouldn't partner with a brand that I wouldn't recommend for free. Now, like the deliverables and the assets and the things like that, that's why it's not free. But it kind of comes down to, is it authentic? Is it real? You guys are involved with Caleb Olson and his Substack, and like talk to me about the other creative ways that you're approaching community and these micro communities that go beyond, again, these big global entities or races, or like what is the is the special sauce really just like we want to find people who are using it and lean into supporting them? Like is that kind of the vibe of where you go?
That is absolutely how it started. And the story there is that, you've been dealing with Brad as our athlete manager or athlete ambassador captain. And Brad is, he is the greatest living advocate for the brand, probably outside me and Johnny in the world. He is like, you cut Brad in half, it says PF&H. He's like through and through. And the story with Brad, which not everyone knows, is that Brad, he's probably got gel in his veins, flow gel. But Brad was a professional triathlete when I first met him. He was using the product, and Brad was effectively the first kind of pro athlete that we sponsored. So Brad has lived that journey of like getting to know us, getting to know the brand. And then we've just, over time, we've probably developed a culture together, but I think it was in all of us to start with, in that, we want to work with athletes who really, really want to use the product and really want to get the support these days from our sports science team. They're the two non-negotiables, because in the past, we haven't made too many mistakes, but we did make a couple of mistakes where we had opportunities that were brought to us by people who managed athletes who we had no prior with, where we did deals with athletes on the basis that they looked good. And then the relationships never really developed into something particularly authentic. And we've also had to turn down working with one or two athletes over the years where either we haven't been able to afford to, or we haven't wanted to pay the kind of money that other companies have been willing to pay them, even though we know they're authentically using our products. But they've decided that the category of sports nutrition is important enough to them financially that the priority is to get the highest dollar amount that they can get for that category. And I've always respected that, as much as I've respected the athletes who've maybe taken a smaller paycheck from us, but got the products they were already using and the sports science support that we invest in that other companies can't offer, because they see it differently. And there's no right or wrong answer to that. And I certainly don't begrudge it with any of the athletes that I've had conversations with where it's been like, well, essentially it's often as simple as like, so-and-so has offered me X. Can you match that or not? Can you get close? And if it's a number which is just either out of our affordability or out of our sort of what we would consider to represent sustainable value, we'll often have to say, no, I'm really sorry, we can't do that. And then what we've tried to do is we've tried to adapt over time. That means we've signed athletes who are on an upward trajectory rather than already being at the top of the sport. So we definitely started working with people like Chris Myers and Caleb Olson before they were certainly starting to make a bit of a mark, but they hadn't had big wins, big results. And then what we'll try and do is we'll try to find creative ways to increase the value and increase the term of those contracts with them over time as they grow and develop and as we grow and develop as a business. And when you look at our roster has evolved and expanded, but we haven't had too many athletes drop off. So our roster is getting bigger all the time at the moment because the goal, Brad's stated goal always is, we'd love you to be the last nutrition company that you sign with, to the end of your career. It's not always going to be possible for everyone, but that's the attitude which we go into the arrangement with. And yeah, we're just trying to make sure that those relationships evolve, and different athletes bring different things. Some athletes bring pure race performances. That's their biggest asset. They're guys or girls that go out and they win on a regular basis. And that's where we then use that to market the association with high performance. You get other athletes who maybe aren't as dominant when it comes to winning and performance, but obviously they might have creative outlets or social media outlets or those kind of things which have which also have a value to a brand. And those other people have really you'll have seen athletes who have really loyal kind of cult followings that may be a bit polarizing for fans, but if we align with that person's character and values and that kind of thing, then they're also great relationships for us. So as long as it's a real relationship and we think it's got long-term potential, we're pretty happy with it.
I love it. Switching gears, pun intended, to the topic we're switching to. You spent some time in F1. I'm curious what, specifically on the business side, what parallels exist in trail and ultra, and what do you think the endurance world can learn from F1, specifically on the business side of things?
The thing that I learned personally from F1 is that association, the brands that got involved in that all wanted obviously involvement with something that was either very glamorous, because you've got your kind of champagne brands and luxury brands and that kind of thing, or you're looking at brands that want to associate with the real high performance aspect of the sport. And Formula One, even back then when I was working in it, which is over 20 years ago now, was a fantastic shop window for all of that kind of stuff. It's even better now, given what Netflix and the Drive to Survive series and everything like that have done. I learned a lot. I was working there, not in the business side. I was a sports scientist and I was working with the team. But what I learned was the power of the sort of, the positive PR that we could get out of that association with performance and fitness and health. And we used to work very closely with the marketing department. We used to go on training camps with the drivers, and we'd have very open access to press and media. We actually did a lot of things where we'd take journalists that were halfway fit and we'd put them through their paces, training with the F1 drivers, which was always a lot of fun because you get a few guys show up who thought they were pretty handy at riding a bike or quite a good runner or something. And we'd bring them on a training camp and show them just at what level some of the drivers were operating at. So trying to intermingle those two things was really useful. I actually found that I really enjoyed that side of things. I made some good contacts in press and PR and sponsorship and that kind of thing, some of which persists to today. I think where it diverges though is obviously in the sort of the scale of it nowadays. Like you and I kind of live in this endurance / ultra trail running world and stuff, which is big to us. But F1 is like another level of big. The kind of money that even a big brand like, say, Nike or On or someone like that could spend in in trail running and make
yeah.
an impact, it's a rounding error on a sponsorship deal for a Formula One team. So you're talking about a whole nother level. And a lot of their stuff is around, it is all about media coverage, media rights, and the TV potential. I think there's less kind of community stuff by a long way in that, whereas the trail running in particular is a lot more focused on community. Obviously, the people you're marketing to are participants in the same sport that you're associating with, whereas Formula One is a pure shop window. So, but for me as an individual, what it was a fantastically, as a young guy, first proper job out of college, it was a really exciting place to go and work. And it's been brilliant to see. Formula One was big then, it kind of dipped and it's come back so strong. It's been fantastic to see.
Do you think that there's some learning around the broadcast of F1 or golf or tennis around the metrics that are seen on screen? Like I was watching on Netflix the race in Miami, and there were like 20 different broadcasts that you could watch. You could watch P1, P2, P3, P20, or you could watch you could tune into a specific driver's view. You could tune into a specific stats view. Like, how do we, or can we even professionalize the broadcast of a trail and ultra race to that effect? Like, and are there ways that we can include heart rate and fueling status and like things like that? Do you see a world where that exists in the future with trail and ultra?
I think technically it'll be possible. Things like we've definitely seen in cycling at times, the ability to broadcast some power output numbers or some heart rate numbers with athletes. And I think if you look at one of the things that UTMB in particular, but also Aravaipa and those sort of people are doing really well, is creating better live broadcasts of events, because that is what people are tuning into to get data. I think I would say with trail and ultra, it needs to start simple though, and not worry too much about how can we get readings off athletes' bodies, but how can we get really accurate leaderboards that are updated and refreshed really quickly and real proper live information. Because you'll have probably had all the same frustrations as the rest of us when you're watching a live broadcast and the commentators, probably not their fault, they may not have the information at their fingertips, but they're chatting away about something that's either not going on the screen, or they're chatting away about something. And what you want to know is like, what's happening in the race? Where are the positions? I think sorting out trackers and really granular live information about all of that is probably the number one thing. Ironman is starting to do that really, really well with the app, with the in-race apps, and the environment in which they operate is far easier to orchestrate that. You're on roads, you're often in urban environments or close to urban environments with good cellular coverage and timing mats and stuff, so they can give much more accurate information. But I think stepping towards that first of all would be, that's the lowest bar to get to. Beyond that though, it would be fascinating, and with different sensors and telemetry, I'm sure it could all be done. Whether you'd get buy-in from athletes in terms of them showing their physiological metrics and things, I'm not so sure. But I definitely think the broadcast side of trail running has improved so much that it's been a big reason. I'm certainly way more engaged with that than I used to be. It's a really good way of me keeping up with stuff when I'm not at the races myself.
You're teeing up a plug for another brand I work with, which is Laurel Innovations. They do race timing, and I ran my first race with Laurel this past weekend. And it operates. It doesn't need cell coverage. It can work on satellites, and you don't need timing mats. You just need a piece of equipment that's this big, and the redundancy is so much higher. And so you can be out in Chamonix or Western States, and you can put hundreds of these trackers on the course and have really strong and redundant in case there's failure metrics of where people are at and what are their splits between and who is actually in the lead.
Yeah, who's moving forward, who's moving back.
Being at Western States and like not knowing who's about to come into the aid station first.
Yeah.
And some of that's like the allure of it. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing as well. It's like, how much do you want to sanitize all of this and kill it with information and all the rest of it? Because there is a bit of fun and excitement. And that there'll always be tension around that, because any sport that starts to, professionalize or whatever you want to call it, and monetize, starts to bring in elements that perhaps don't jibe with the original intention. There was that big hoo-ha about UTMB coming into the sport, and a lot of athletes signed letters, didn't they, about not liking it and stuff. But then we're seeing massive fields at UTMB races a couple of years later. So I think that sort of development, it'll happen, and hopefully more of it will be good than not so good, but it's going to happen, because as participation grows, it's going to get bigger.
Totally. Okay, so you're 15 years in. What do you believe now that you would have laughed at in 2011?
That we're still alive in business, honestly. Yeah. There were times if Johnny listens to this, which he might well do, he'll be laughing when he hears that, because he'll remember sitting in the shed in my garden when it was me and him and Dawn, who's still our office manager now and bookkeeper, where I was there with my head in my hands, practically crying, or actually crying, because we were down to our last $2,000 or whatever, or some disaster had occurred, and we were pretty sure that we shipped a container of product to the US once, our first lot. We put the majority of our stock in it and didn't get the import paperwork right, and we got a letter back saying that they were either going to burn it on the dock, or we'd have to pay $8,000, I think it was, to return it. We didn't have $8,000. So there were all sorts of stories like that. So I think the number one thing would be, like, if you'd have told me we were still here and there were 50 odd people in the company 15 years ago, I'd have laughed you out of my shed.
What's the lesson in that?
Keep putting one foot in front of the other, really. I think. And we did for a long time call this the business that wouldn't die, because every time we had a near death experience, it was only that. It was a near death experience, and we picked ourselves up and carried on. And yeah, I mean, I've never run 100 miles. I have run 100K, but I can't, and I've certainly not run 250 miles, but I can imagine that some of that mentality around just sort of really not thinking about where the finish line is and keep putting one foot in front of the other is just a huge part of it, basically. And I think as well, kind of, you've got to fundamentally, I don't always and haven't always enjoyed what I've done over the years, but I've always asked myself the question, what would I rather be doing? And the answer has probably been not a lot else other than doing this. So double down, put the effort in, see it grow.
What's been your experience as the CEO of the company?
I think for many years, the CEO title was kind of almost laughable, because when you've got about 3 people in the company, you kind of perhaps got a CEO, but it's not, so for me, it's been, I've always enjoyed, the bits I've enjoyed most with the business have been the creative side and the kind of directional thinking side. And I think they're important things for a CEO at all times, but especially early on in a company, because you've got to have a strong North Star on where you're going. And we always had that in the respect that I really wanted to work with endurance athletes, help endurance athletes not have the problems that I had, and sort of be involved in those, in helping athletes get the most out of those sports. As we've developed and transitioned, like now, I'm actually, as of January this year, I stepped out of the CEO role. Johnny, who's stepped into the CEO role, and Johnny's been our COO almost since day one, because he's a operations, logistics and finance kind of guy. And now the CEO role still requires a level of, vision and all those kind of things. But now it also requires a massive operational head to keep the operation that we've got spinning and on track and all that kind of thing. So for me, the experience has been from going up, and I'm still able to sit in that kind of strategic role and still very involved day to day, but with him taking a lot of that operational load. So it's evolved over the years.
It's one of those roles that people just find themselves in sometimes as you solve it's like a accidental business owner. You're solving a problem for yourself, and 15 years later, you still exist, and someone's got to run the business, right?
Exactly. Yeah. No, an accidental owner is exactly what I ended up being. And I'm really glad. It's a very happy accident. There's no one I'd rather be working for or with, but it was definitely not intentional.
Definitely. Awesome. Andy, this has been a blast. Where can we find you and your team this summer if we want to learn more about precision?
The big one coming up in the trail community, as you know, will be TrailCon up at between Broken Arrow and Western States. So we've got a small team up at Broken Arrow, a big team up at TrailCon, and supporting, I think, 11 athletes now we're crewing at Western States. So come along to there. We've got a new product launch with the watermelon chews that we soft launched at Cocodona. And then later in the year, we'll have a bit of a presence working with athletes, working with single track over at UTMB. I think there are two other major trail events that will be out the rest of the year. And then we've got things like Boulderthon and CIM in the road marathon world later in the year, and Honolulu Marathon now as well in December.
Awesome. Andy, appreciate the wisdom and the chat, and we'll see you out there.
Yeah, see you on the road. Thanks, John.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Long Run Labs. If you like this episode, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who's building something of their own. We'll be back next Tuesday with more stories at the intersection of endurance and entrepreneurship from the people shaping the outdoor industry in ways big and small. Until then, keep showing up, keep asking questions, and we'll see you out there.